But in the process of the spiritual growth, Paul says that we have to stop being babes to where we're being fed all the time, and we have to be the ones that are doing the feeding. So it's getting to a point in time to where we need to start going out and bringing others in so that we can make disciples, and then those disciples can go on and make disciples, and we can make new disciples, and then we'll start seeing growth. And that's the way it is. So with that being said, I challenge each and every one of you as we start preparing for all the new stuff that's coming up, bring one person. Just one person. Okay? I want you guys, and it could be a friend, it could be a relative, it really doesn't matter to me, but one person that's within the age group of who you feel that you want here. Okay? So, Tyler, if that's somebody that's your age, then it's somebody that's your age. If it's somebody that's in middle school that you somehow have a connection with, that you want to be able to teach them more or mentor them, and let it be somebody in middle school. It's just whoever you feel like, and I pull on Tyler, or pick on Tyler on that, not to just single him out, but because I know Tyler has the capability in different clubs and stuff that he participates in, that he gets to see a lot of people, as I'm sure that all the rest of you do also. But find that one person that you want to share this with, because you should have that excitement within your soul that you don't want to keep it to yourself. You should be wanting to say, here. Think about those times as a kid that you did something at school. And what's the first thing you wanted to do with that? If it was that important to you, what was the first thing you wanted to do when you got home? If you were like me,
tell mom and dad.
And I know Braden was like that. Yeah, it was go and tell mom and dad, look at this thing that I did. Look at what I learned. Look at what was going on. You know, so that's the way that you should feel about this, the gospel. I want to share this with you. Okay? So, let's look at a couple of things here. We've looked at covenant relationship, the beginning of it, and to get set up, what did we look at last week? Do you guys remember? What was it we touched on last week? Right. Interpretation. Okay. Properly interpreting the Bible so that we can understand exactly what it's talking about. So that being said, part of what sometimes makes understanding the Bible difficult is the distance of time, space, and culture. Who knows what I mean by that? Okay, time is pretty simple. Years have passed since the Bible was wrote. Some books, more years have passed. Other books, less years have passed. But years have passed since this thing was wrote. Even though we have multiple new translations coming out each and every year, sometimes the reason that some of those translations get parts wrong or even the whole thing wrong is because time and space has passed, and we want to be able to put it in today's pop culture perspective. And I'll give you a big example of that. Plus just the lack of the Spirit guiding people. So one big example of that is, how many of you have heard about the Queen George version of the Bible? Or Queen James, I'm sorry. I always make a joke of it and then I say it jokingly. How many of you have heard about the Queen James version of the Bible? Queen James version of the Bible. Anybody? I know Samantha has. The Queen James version of the Bible is the homosexual version of the Bible. And why do I bring that up? Well, because homosexuality tends to be a big topic in churches. That seems to be one sin that we focus on when we should just be looking at the whole picture. So in the Queen James version of the Bible, it removes homosexuality from being a sin unless it happens in certain circumstances. Like if it happened in the temple, then it was a sin. Or if it happened out of homosexual marriage, then it became a sin and stuff like that. So that's a huge interpretation problem, because that's not what the Bible originally stated. Okay, there's other places. How many of you like using the NIV version of the Bible? Okay, so there's places that even in the NIV version of the Bible, that when we look at it, it removes the name of Jesus in several spots. I think there's about 12 or 13 passages that it completely removes the name of Jesus, or that it does not call Jesus the Son of God, whereas in certain translations, like the King James and the New King James, it does call him the Son of God. Or if you go all the way back to Greek versions of the New Testament, it calls him the Son of God, and it just completely removes that portion of wording. There's certain places, which this is important in what we're studying with covenant relationship, there's certain places in the NIV and even the CSB that I like using, and in the ESV and so many other translations, the Passion Translation, the New Living Translation, all of these, that they remove the word blood and its importance when it speaks about the covenant between God and man, especially when it talks about Jesus. That blood's pretty important. Okay, so why does it do that? Well, because sometimes the translations are not taken into context that they were meant. So, what are some differences that we can think of, just some simple differences that we can think of between now and in the 21st century where we're at, and back then let's just go back to the first century of when the church started. What are some differences, Braden?
No technology.
No technology. That pretty much covers a lot of stuff. Okay. What else?
Women's roles.
Say again?
Women's roles.
Women's roles. Okay. That is a huge one, and that's very touchy. I mean, I'm sure if I were to get up in front of the church and I were to speak on a woman being subject to her husband, there'd be a lot of people that get upset because they don't understand exactly what that means, because it doesn't mean that she's a slave to the husband. But if you look over into later in the New Testament, Paul calls them co-heirs in traversing this life. What else? Somebody give me something else. Braden.
I believe it was a different style of houses there.
The houses in which they built. Okay, so those are some simple ones. What about some of the major things?
Was the Bible completely written out then?
The Bible was not completely written out then.
Yes.
If you look at the early first century, no, it wasn't completely out. By the end of by the end of the first century, yes, it was, because most of the guys that wrote it were already dead. So obviously they had already wrote it. So depending on which part of the first century you're looking at, yes, the Bible itself. They had the manuscripts that they referred to all the time, which was what? The Old Testament.
The scroll.
The scrolls, the Old Testament. Okay, so they had that. So they had half of what we have, but they didn't have everything that we have at this point in time. So they didn't have anything from Matthew on to the end of the Bible. What are some other major differences that you guys can think of, Braden?
There were different rights back then, like the church was being persecuted. Now we live in a free country.
Different rights, absolutely. The church being persecuted, the way that it was persecuted. So that's different depending on not just time, but culture also, because there's certain cultures here that we don't get persecuted, right? For instance, the United States. Can't really call persecution what goes on here in the United States when you look at Russia, for instance, or China or whatnot. You know, yeah, things are uncomfortable, but I wouldn't necessarily call it persecution. The amount of Christians, yeah, absolutely. Not only the amount of Christians, but with the amount of Christians, the type of influence that the Christians had at that point in time, right? So yeah, these are definitely some major instances. So, what about if you're able to understand some of these? If you're not able to understand some of these differences, one of the best ways to figure out how to understand the Bible through these differences is being able to understand the covenant of God, or the covenants of God. I refer to it as the covenant of God, and when we get to the last day of the series, you'll see why I say the covenant, because a lot of people will say the covenants of God, but when you actually look at all of the covenants throughout the Bible, they all do one thing, right? And what's that one thing? They point to redemption in Jesus. Okay, so that's why I just say the covenant. Even though we're going to go over what are referred to as multiple covenants, and you guys will start seeing some of the similarities between them. So maybe we don't understand why circumcision was so important in the Bible. Circumcision was part of the covenant, and there was a specific meaning behind circumcision. It wasn't just to be circumcised for health reasons like what we do nowadays. Okay, because nowadays circumcision is for health reasons. Back then, circumcision was because, hey, I'm an Israelite and there's a covenant between us and God. It could be about meats. Why was it so important for a Jew not to eat pork or any type of animal with a split hoof instead of a solid hoof, or something like that? I might have that backwards. It Might have been not eating the solid hoof and being able to eat the split hoof. So why was that so important? Why did that defile a man, as the Bible puts it? Why did a man after God's own heart, who's that? David. Why did David, being known as a man after God's own heart, why was he not able to build the temple? Okay, and we get into that. Yeah, we know that he messed around with what eventually became his wife, and he killed the husband. But what was the meaning behind it that God said you can't build the temple? Because he repented of the sin, but there was still something that came from that prevented him from building God's temple. So why would we need to know that? Well, because it's part of the covenant. It's listed within the covenant. So yeah, there's what's referred to as a conceptual gap that exists. That conceptual gap covers time, it covers culture, just any number of things in there of then versus now. So being able to understand the concept of God's covenant, we are able to understand everything else in the Bible as to why it existed the way that it existed, why it was wrote the way that it was wrote, and why it applies to us in the way that it applies to us today. So, biblical covenants. Well, let me back up a little bit. The concept of a covenant. How did covenants take place? Or what was a covenant? Braden, what's a covenant?
Wasn't it like a deal, sort of?
So it was kind of a deal. So how would we put it in modern day terms? What is a covenant to us today? Do we still have covenants? How? Braden.
In marriage?
Marriage is a very good example of covenant.
Like an agreement or a contract.
An agreement or a contract. Legally binding usually, right? In some way or form, whether it's a peace agreement that's signed between countries or a agreement that's signed between a bank and people buying a house, or an agreement on the borders of a land between two neighboring properties that are split and become two separate properties that they used to be one property. So being able to understand this is going to be very important, because it shows how even in modern times the covenants that are developed, or the agreements that are developed through a certain type of relationship. And when we look at it like that, we're able to understand it like that. We understand that God's covenants are made because of God's relationship with us. Not necessarily because of our relationship with Him, but because of God's relationship with us. And why do I say it like that? Well, because God's covenants were always established on the basis of truth in the relationship, which sometimes we miss the mark on that. It's the circumstances in which God set for the relationship. It's the promises and rewards of that relationship that God desires to have with us. Just like with the peace agreement, if so-and-so country that we were at war with decides that they're not going to follow the covenant that we've set with them, what's going to happen? We're probably going back to war with them. Okay, so there's promises and rewards, and then the second part is the consequences of not following those conditions which were set forth in the covenant. In the covenant, I'm sorry, not the government, the covenant. So, as Braden made mention, and I have it right here in my notes, one of the most familiar examples of a covenant is marriage itself. So we can see that they were pretty important because it applied to every aspect of life. But I'm going to give you guys a quick example. So Tyler, come on up here. So the covenant wasn't just the ability to say, hey, we agree on this. And I'm not going to make him put his hand under my thigh like what they did in the Old Testament. So you lucked out right there, buddy. But there were other things that happened in the covenant. Okay, what were some of these other things that happened in the covenant? So I'm making a covenant with Tyler, and let's say let's say that this is about 400 AD. How in the world does everybody know that Tyler and I made a covenant if we're over here and we just say, all right, we agree on that? All right, cool, we agree on that, and then we go. Yes, people's word probably meant a lot more to them back then, but I'm making a covenant with him, so I'm going to say, you know what, Tyler? I agree on this with you, so here, take my jacket. That looks good on him, doesn't it? Look at that right there. Oh, take my jacket. You know what? And I'm not going to give you this ring, but if I had another ring, I'd take that ring and I would put it on your finger because that ring would be of importance to me. Okay? So there was an exchange that the covenant wasn't just here. Everybody knew about the covenant. Why?
Because it was your jacket, and they probably recognized it before, and if you give it to him, they'll notice.
Okay, so that's the how. But why? Accountability. Accountability. And as, thank you, Tyler. I'll buy you one of your own, I promise.
No, I don't want that. I got issues.
So it's about, there was a certain level of accountability that needed to be achieved in the covenants and everything. And that's why you would see this. And God, of course, He didn't have to give us a jacket. He didn't have to give us anything, really, because we know that God can't lie. So if He says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And in the covenants which He would make, or in the covenant which He would make and continue it down the line, we knew that it would be true. But He still gave us something similar to a jacket that would cover us. What was it? Remember, I said this was one of the words that some of the translations take out.
The Son of Man?
Not this. Well, it was the Son of Man, but what was it about the Son of Man? The blood. So He gave us the blood that would cover us. Okay, so think about that. The blood is like the jacket that was exchanged. Okay, so biblical covenants. There are several biblical covenants that take place. Can anybody name one of the biblical covenants besides Samantha? Because I told her what they were on the way in. Some of them.
The covenants about,
The rainbow. What's that covenant referred to? Do you know? What do we refer to that covenant as? What's the theological name for that? The Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant. Okay, there was a promise that was made between God and Noah. It was a promise made to Noah, actually.
Abraham.
There's the Abrahamic covenant, okay, which is the promise that was made
I heard y'all talk.
between Abraham and God, but it was mostly what? It was mostly God to Abraham, right? It was mostly God to Noah. But there were certain things that were set that each one of them had to do. And interestingly enough, those are the two that we're going to cover today. But there were other ones also. There's literally thousands of covenants that you can find in the Bible.
Are they all just names with ick on the end?
Yeah, because you've got some other ones. So the ones that we're going to be covering today are the Noahic and the Abrahamic. And then we go into the next week, which would be the Mosaic and the Davidic.
Moses one.
And the what?
Peteric.
The Peteric covenant. So the Davidic. And then we go into the one that doesn't have the ick in it, which is what? The New Covenant. Okay. So that's actually, if you want to narrow it down even more than those 5, you can narrow it down to 2, which are what? The New Covenant and the Old Covenant. Which when you look at them, they're still the same, regardless of if we call them New Testament and Old Testament. So the 5 that we're covering are what?
Noahic.
Noahic? Abrahamic.
The Peteric.
Peter.
Mosaic.
The Mosaic, the Davidic,
New covenant.
and the New Covenant. There you go. The Peteric covenant.
The
Um,
Hannock.
the
The
Hannock.
Noelic. Ooh, I like that one. Hilaric.
The Bradanic.
So
That sounds like the Titanic.
the Noahic covenant. What was the Noahic covenant? There you go. I got it too. What was the Noahic covenant?
Rainbow.
But what about it? That was the sign, not the covenant. That was the sign of the covenant.
He would never flood the earth again.
That what?
He would never flood the earth again.
He would never destroy the earth again with water, which alludes us to what?
Fire.
Well, we say fire, but it eludes us if he says, I will not destroy it like this again. Then the alternate is, or the foreseen is that there would be another destruction that would come. Okay, so keep that in mind. There is another destruction to come. And as you look at the covenant itself, it tells you, I will not destroy the world in this manner again. And you're able to do all of this, but you can't be doing this. Because if you do this, then destruction will come again, even though it won't be in the same manner. Okay, so that's all paraphrase. So from Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. This is the covenant that God establishes with Paul. Right? Oh, Noah. Well, yeah. I guess that makes sense being that it's the Noahic covenant, right? So, we're just going to look at a couple of verses here. Verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Okay? So right there, that's the number one thing. Be fruitful and multiply. Haven't we heard that before?
Yeah.
Where did we hear that before?
Abraham?
No, before.
Adam and
Abraham
Eve.
was Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve actually had a covenant also, right? And they broke the covenant. So then we had Noah was the next covenant. Okay, so there were also some other things. If you look down into verse 3, every creature that lives and moves will be food for you. Man, I love that verse because I love steak. You know what? If God didn't want me eating steak, he wouldn't have made it a meat. So, steak is delicious. Steak is what?
So good.
Oh, okay, I thought you said it was gross. I was about to have to get up there and go and pray for you and cast out some demons right there.
Verse 4 says you can't eat sushi.
Verse 4 says you cannot eat what?
You should be like put in jail.
Here's listen. Why does it say you can't eat sushi, Christoph? Because that was actually my next.
You cannot eat meat with its lifeblood in it.
There you go. You can't eat meat with its lifeblood. Who likes steak well done?
I don't like steak at all.
You don't like steak at all? Get out.
Christoph likes his
I
rare.
mean, if I could have a blue steak, I'd be happy.
So who likes their steak well done? Seriously.
Sometimes.
Man, am I glad that we don't fall under this covenant anymore, because I like my steak about medium, maybe a little bit less. I don't always cook it like that because I quit paying attention to it sometimes, and then I got to put some extra juices in there.
Hey,
To
I cooked a good
but
steak last
she
night.
did cook a very good steak. Let's give my wife a hand for that. So why did we have to avoid eating raw meat?
Because it's bad for you.
Well, how does it refer to blood?
I like the blood.
The lifeblood. So what does that tell us that blood was considered?
Unholy.
Life. That's why in the Noahic covenant they were not allowed to do that. And actually that carried through the entire law of the Old Testament. And even practicing Jews nowadays, there's certain things that they won't eat. They won't eat pork. I wouldn't make it. I love bacon. They can't eat.
Danielle would starve.
They can't eat fish without scales. Fish without scales. How many of you like swordfish? How many have had swordfish?
Have I?
Yes, you've had swordfish. It's pretty good. How about tuna? How many of you like tuna? Not like canned tuna, chicken of the sea. I'm talking about like tuna steaks.
I think I have one down here. I just
Mhm.
don't like.
So a lot of people will have it for an appetizer if they go to like Outback Steakhouse. They have it as an appetizer. What do they call it there?
Ahi chicken.
Ahi, seared ahi. Oh, it's so good. So you're breaking two rules there. It's not scaled and it's got the lifeblood in it. So you're breaking two rules there. How about shark? How many people have tasted shark? Shark is actually pretty good.
Have I?
It's pretty good. No, I don't think you have. But shark is pretty good. But shark is a non-scaled fish, so a Jew can't eat that. So there are certain things that they couldn't eat because it made them unclean. And here's the interesting thing. So I'll have to look for it at some point in time. But there was everybody's always looking for the next best diet to live by, right? You know, you've got the Atkins diet. You've got keto diet. You've got all these diets.
You got vegan.
And so there was a university, I can't remember which university it was, but they did a research on what the healthiest diet was that a person could live by. You know what that diet ended up being when they finally listed out everything that you could and could not eat and how to eat it? It is the same diet that's found in the book of Leviticus, the Levitical diet, which is the same diet that we find in the Noahic covenant. Interesting, huh? Science once again proves what God was saying all along. So anyway, that's a little tangent right there. So anyway, so they couldn't eat raw meat because the raw meat represented lifeblood. If we look down to verse 6. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed. For God made humans in his image. So if we slay one human, then we're saying that God's image doesn't matter, is basically what we're looking at here. But what was different about that? Why was that new? If you kill somebody, your life will be required of you also in the same manner, is basically what it was saying. Why is that new? The Ten Commandments didn't come till later, so it wasn't because of thou shalt not kill, because this is where Moses got that from.
It was
Okay.
after the first murder.
Say again?
It was after the first murder.
It was after the first murder, but what happened to that first murderer?
He
Was
had a
he
mark-
killed?
No, he had a mark on his head and got sent out of.
He had a mark put on him to protect him. And here, if you do it, you're going to be died. You're going to die. You're going to be died.
Killed.
You're going to be killed.
You're gonna kill that.
Killed. You're going to be killed dead. Okay? So taking a life would require one's life in the same manner, which was different than what happened with Cain. And why? Because when God did that to Cain, what happened later? Who knows the story of Tubal-Cain?
Was he murdered?
Nope. Remember, Tubal-Cain was the one that he was a descendant of Cain, that he went out and he said that he killed more men than what Cain killed. So remember, God said that if anybody takes Cain, that it will be on them sevenfold, wasn't it? And then Tubal-Cain says, well, because I've killed more men, then when God avenges me, then he's going to avenge me even greater. Okay? Multiple fold more than what he would have avenged Cain. So God actually was going to avenge somebody himself if they messed with Cain, who had already killed, and he actually put a mark on him to protect him. Okay? But here it says if you kill a human, your life will be required by humans. Okay? So from that is actually where we get the death penalty from, even in modern times. Okay? And then God made the promise of the bow, that he would never flood the earth again, but that also gave us a warning that in the future, if we couldn't hold to this promise, then we would be wiped out. So God promised Noah's descendants that they would live by the covenant. So who did it cover in Noah's descendants? Anybody?
Everybody?
Everybody.
Since everybody else has died?
Everybody. So we don't have to go all the way back to Abraham to see where everybody's related. All we got to do is go back to Noah. Why? Because it was just Noah and his 3 sons and their wives that were left. So therefore, that's where everything comes from. Okay? So, the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Okay. So, I'm going to try and get through this here in about the next 10 minutes. The Lord said to Abraham, go out of your land, your relatives, and your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Interesting. Interesting. So then, if we look further into Abraham's life, we'll see that this was actually repeated on multiple times. Who remembers the song Father Abraham? Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Okay, so the Abrahamic covenant is the most central covenant to the Bible. Why? Do we fall under the Noahic covenant?
Yes.
Anybody else? Does everybody think yes? Does anybody think no? You think no? Okay. So we fall under the Noahic covenant also. We fall under the Abrahamic covenant. Do we fall under the Davidic covenant?
Which was the Davidic one?
Davidic, we haven't gotten to yet. Well, we do. Remember what I said at the beginning? All of these covenants that we separate into different covenants, what are they? They're God's covenant. One covenant, remember? But this is just showing different ways. So why do we fall under the Noahic covenant? Well, because God said
Everyone's descended from
all of your descendants. Did you descend from Noah? Yeah? Okay, so you fall under that covenant. Okay, and then Abraham, how do we fall under the Abrahamic covenant? We obviously know that we do, right? Because we just said that we do. But how do we fall under it? Well, if we look over into the New Testament says that if you are believers and followers of Jesus Christ, you are descendants of Abraham. Okay? So even though we may not physically be descendants of Abraham, spiritually we're descendants of Abraham, so we can fall under the covenant of Abraham, which is God's blessings being upon us. Okay? So, the blessings promised to Abraham would extend through all the peoples on the earth indirectly also. Why? What did it say right there? And all nations will be blessed by you, right? All nations will be blessed by you. Okay? Understanding the Abrahamic covenant is the key to understanding theological concepts like the promised land, the people of God, and inheritance. Did you guys know that inheritance, the rules of inheritance actually comes from the Abrahamic covenant? We do follow that at times when we look at inheritance, okay? Because we leave stuff to our heirs. And generally, even nowadays, the oldest heir will get stuff, unless there's been a falling out and stuff like that. The oldest heir is usually the one that's supposed to get everything, but occasionally not the oldest one gets it. So, did that happen with Abraham? Did the oldest one get it? No, the oldest one didn't get it. Isaac got it. He was the second son born to Abraham, but the first born through Sarah is promised. Okay? So, what are the parts of this covenant that you guys can think of? Let me give you guys one. Abraham's offspring would be forever in God's favor. Okay? So that applies to physical offspring as well as to spiritual offspring that we see in the New Testament when Paul speaks about it. What was another one? I just said another one. Who's going to be blessed?
Oh, his descendants, or his inheritance.
All nations are blessed through you. Okay? And what else? All nations are going to bless him, and those that don't bless him will be cursed. Right? Also, as we continue to seek in other scriptures, not the one that I read tonight, but as we look in other scriptures through Abraham's life, we will see that God promises an eternal heir to Abraham. Who was that? Who's the eternal heir?
Oh, wait, no.
Jesus. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So, we also find later in the Abrahamic covenant, and this is going to get real interesting if we were to dig into it further, that Abraham is promised to be the father of many nations. Well, how many sons did Abraham have? Who knows?
3?
Many? According to the song, right? How many sons does the Bible tell us that he had?
3?
2? 3? How many?
1,000,000,000.
3.
Who can tell me how many sons Abraham had?
8.
8.
8. Wow, you guys are great. Well, if he had 8, how many did Sarah have?
8.
1.
Yeah.
Who else had a son? Hagar. How many did Hagar have from Abraham?
1.
7.
No.
4.
Right, so if that's not 8 though. Well, most people don't know this because most people haven't read completely through the Bible, but you guys should, because we've been putting out, we haven't this month, and forgive me, but we had put out to where you guys should have at least got through the book of Genesis. Who else, no cheating, who else had sons from Abraham? Well, there's this little known person, Keturah. Everybody flip over to chapter 25. What does it say? The first verse. Anybody? Who's got it?
Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him. Oh, keep on.
Keep going.
And she bore him Zimran.
Yeah, I knew that was coming. Okay, you can stop. So there's six boys there.
And
Shua.
How many of you guys knew that Abraham even had another wife?
No.
You did?
Well, just because I did the reading.
I didn't even know he had more
So he did have another wife. And come on in. He had another wife, and most people don't talk about it because they don't really see the significance in it. But if you continue to look at the Abrahamic covenant, you will see that Abraham marrying this woman and having 6 other kids was part of the covenant itself. Why? Because he was told that he was going to be the father of many nations. So what did Ishmael father?
The Ishmaelites.
The Ishmaelites. Nice, good try. Ishmael was the father of what we currently consider the Arabs. Okay? What did Isaac father?
Israelites.
The Israelites. Okay? So the Jews or the Hebrews or many other names that we refer to them by. What about the other sons? What did they father?
The Midianites from Midian.
Maybe.
They fathered more nations.
So it lists some of the nations in there in the following verses, but those nations don't actually exist today. But if we look at the cultures and societies that exist, you can see if you start doing the genealogy and stuff, you can see where China came out of that, where the Europeans came out of that, where a different part of the Europeans came out of that, where the Greeks came out of that, where other parts of Asia had stuff to come out of that, where the Russians came out of that because they were neither Far East Asians or Europeans. So there, you start seeing all these different cultures that even today that exist. Yes, sir.
What about the West Virginians?
Yeah.
Most of us are German, so that would be the European strand.
Yeah.
I'm French
So,
Canadian.
so anyway, you can see where even in this scripture that it's a further fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, and it even showed. What about if we look at verses 13 and 16? What does that tell us about? This is how specific and accurate God's promises and covenants are to us. What does it tell us about? Chapter 15. What? Did you forget your jacket?
No,
Okay.
that's hers.
Oh, okay.
The kids of the kids of the kids of the kids.
Oh, but what about it? Read me chapter 15, verses 13 through 16 right quick.
No!
Somebody.
These are the names of Ishmael's sons. Their names according to the family records are,
All right, skip down to verse 16.
okay, these are Ishmael's sons, and these are their names by their settlements and their encampments.
All right, stop
12
right there.
leaders of their clans.
In the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure.
Wait, what? Genesis what?
Genesis 15 and 13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know
Yes.
this for certain, your offspring
Sorry.
will be resident aliens for 400 years in the land that does not belong to them, and how they will be enslaved and oppressed. What is that talking about?
When Joseph, when the Egyptians were in Egypt.
Wow, so you're telling
I mean,
me
Israelites, I'm sorry.
you're telling me that Abraham knew that the Israelites were going to be captive for 400 years.
Mhm.
How many years did they spend in Egypt? If you
400.
Yeah, they spent 400 years. That was pretty accurate by God saying that, right? Okay. So then if we skip down, it says, in the 4th generation, they will return here. Where's here?
Israelite
Uh,
land.
In Israel, the Israelite land. That's correct. For the iniquity of the Amorites have not yet been reached for full measure. Okay, so God foretold about things that were going to happen to them and how he was going to be with them throughout and bring them out. And God does the same to us today. He tells us that there's going to be certain things that we go through. And he may not be as specific as this, that we know that, in 2 years I'm going to be a multimillionaire with a yacht. And no, he doesn't tell us that. Or in 2 years, I'm going to be laying on a hospital bed and I'm going to have polio, even though it's been exterminated and it's going to come back and I'm not going to be able to walk. No, he doesn't tell me that right now. Could he? Absolutely he could, because he did it before and he can do it again. He can do whatever he wants to. But he was very specific. The point is he was very specific in his covenants that he showed them this is what's going to happen. He didn't just show them this is where you and I are making a covenant and this is what I'm going to do for you. But he showed them this is where things are going to get rough. And it's not that he broke the covenant during that time. He still kept the covenant. And it's not that even today that the covenant has been broken, because he still keeps those covenants with us today. He keeps them with us. And more importantly, he still keeps those covenants with Israel. Okay? Israel is no longer his chosen nation. They are still his chosen nation. And as you listen to what Pastor Hal has been preaching on Sunday mornings, you will see that Israel is still the chosen nation. There's just a pause because God gave everybody else a chance at life. Why did God give the Gentiles a chance? And here's where I'm going to tie these two covenants together. Why did God give the Gentiles a chance? Does the Abrahamic covenant cover us physically? But which covenant does? Noahic, not nomadic. We're not moving around well, we do move around all the time, but the Noahic covenant. So under the Noahic covenant, who was it for? All of Noah's descendants, which included everybody. And God said that he made promises to them. And so in order for him to do that, he had to be able to come through the Abrahamic covenant in some way to be able to still keep his promises from the Noahic covenant that were made to us. And even if you look back to the promises that were given to Adam and Eve, this pause that's going on right now for Christianity, and then we have the 7 years later that Pastor Hal's going to be getting to here before too long. You have the 7 years where he returns to Israel, and you start seeing all the things in Israel that they're doing. You'll start seeing the sacrifices and stuff like that again. He paused, not because he turned his back on Israel, but he paused because he made a promise to Noah that all of his descendants, which includes us, would have a chance to be able to serve him, would have blessings from him. So if he wouldn't have paused in the Abrahamic covenant, then he wouldn't have been able to keep his promise to Noah. It's kind of amazing to think about it like that, right? So now you see where we fit into the picture. Okay, we're going to get a little bit more into it because next week we're going to go into the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant. So that being said, I'm sorry I went 5 minutes over. Any questions? What questions do you guys have? Braden?